Order! I'm sorry. Has to be linked to the trade question. This is completely off beam. I'm sorry, but we've got to stick to the question. As important as the matter is, and quite rightly, you wish to get out, this is not the question to do so. And no, I'm sorry. Well, I'm going to make the judgment, and the judgment so far it's not. We're wasting time for the members.
Does he understand? Does he understand why the people of these islands, especially those of us in Scotland, treat him with such contempt?
The Prime Minister's face went pale. His hands gripped the dispatch box so tight his knuckles turned white. Around him, the chamber descended into absolute chaos as the Reform MP unleashed words so devastating, so brutally honest, that even his own party members couldn't defend him. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be replayed millions of times, shared across every platform and talked about in every corner of Britain. Because this wasn't just another political argument, this was the moment Keir Starmer's entire premiership came crashing down in front of the nation's eyes. And it started with just 5 words that cut like a knife through every promise he'd ever made. The tension in the House of Commons was suffocating. You could feel it pressing down on every MP, every journalist, every person watching from the gallery above. Prime Minister's questions had been going for 20 minutes already, and Keir Starmer looked comfortable. Too comfortable. He'd batted away questions from the Conservatives with ease, dismissed concerns about the economy with his usual rehearsed lines, and was clearly expecting another routine Wednesday afternoon. But he had no idea what was about to hit him. The Reform MP stood up slowly, deliberately, letting the moment breathe. There was something different in their posture, something that made even the rowdiest backbenchers stop their chatter and pay attention. The Speaker called their name, and for a split second, the entire chamber held its breath. This wasn't going to be a polite inquiry about local services or a gentle probe about government policy. Everyone could sense it. The storm was here. The Reform MP didn't waste time with pleasantries. Their voice cut through the chamber like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. They started with the basics, the promises Labour made before the election, the guarantees Starmer himself had stood behind, swearing to the British people that things would be different under his leadership. No more broken promises, no more lies, no more putting party before country. That's what he'd said. Standing in town halls and community centres and across Britain, looking ordinary people in the eye and asking for their trust. And millions had given it to him. They'd believed him when he said he'd fix the NHS, when he promised to bring down energy bills, when he swore he'd tackle the immigration crisis that had been tearing communities apart. They'd believed every word. But now, months into his premiership, where were those promises? Where was the change? The Reform MP's words came faster now, gaining momentum like a freight train with no brakes. They rattled off statistic after statistic, each one more damning than the last. NHS waiting lists hadn't gone down, they'd gone up. Energy bills hadn't been reduced. They'd stayed exactly where they were, crushing families who were already struggling to keep the lights on and the heating running. And immigration, the numbers were higher than ever before. The Rwanda plan had been scrapped with nothing to replace it. The boats were still coming across the channel every single day, and local councils were being forced to house asylum seekers in hotels while British veterans slept on the streets. The chamber was electrified now. Starmer tried to respond, but his usual confidence was cracking. He started with his standard lines about inheriting a difficult situation from the previous government, about how change takes time, about how his government was working tirelessly to fix the problems. But the Reform MP wasn't having it. They cut through his response with surgical precision, pointing out that Labour had been in power long enough to show some progress, any progress, on at least one of their major promises. But there was nothing. Just excuses, deflections, and the same tired rhetoric that had been used by every failing government for decades. The chamber erupted into chaos. MPs were shouting from all sides now, some defending Starmer, others piling on with their own criticisms. The Speaker was banging his gavel, desperately trying to restore order, but it was useless. Something had been unleashed in that room, something that couldn't be put back in the box. This wasn't just about policy disagreements anymore. This was about trust, about honesty, about whether the people running this country actually cared about the people they were supposed to serve. And right now, watching Starmer struggle to regain control of the narrative, it was clear that millions of Brits were asking themselves the same question. Had they been lied to again? The Reform MP wasn't backing down. If anything, they were just getting started. As the chaos in the chamber began to settle, they pressed forward with even more force, their voice rising above the din of angry MPs. They moved onto the economy, and this is where things got truly brutal. Because while Starmer had been busy telling the country that Labour had a plan for growth, that they were the party of working people, the reality on the ground told a completely different story. Taxes were going up, not just for the wealthy, not just for big corporations, but for ordinary working families who were already stretched to breaking point. National insurance contributions had increased, council taxes were rising across the country. The freeze on fuel duty had been lifted, meaning every time someone filled up their car to get to work, they were paying more. And for what? What were people getting in return for all this extra money being sucked out of their pockets? The services weren't improving. The roads were still full of potholes, the hospitals were still overwhelmed, the schools were still underfunded. It was the same old story of a government taking more and delivering less, and the British people were sick of it. The Reform MP pulled out a sheet of paper, holding it up for everyone to see. On it were the exact words Starmer had used during the election campaign. Promises printed in black and white that could never be taken back or denied. The MP read them out loud, slowly and deliberately, letting each broken promise hang in the air like an accusation. No tax rises for working people. That was promise number one, lie number one. Because working people were paying more now than they had been before Labour took power. Shorter NHS waiting times within the first year. Promise number two, lie number two, because the waiting lists had actually grown longer and people were dying while waiting for treatment that should have been available months ago. A freeze on immigration until the system was fixed. Promise number three. The biggest. Starmer's face had changed now. The composed, confident mask was slipping. You could see it in his eyes, the way they darted around the chamber, looking for support from his own MPs, many of whom were staring at their feet or their phones, unable to meet his gaze. He tried to interrupt, to challenge the Reform MP's figures, but they were ready for him. They had receipts. Official government statistics, reports from independent think tanks, statements from Starmer's own ministers that contradicted what he was saying right now. Every time he tried to deflect or deny, the Reform MP hit back harder with concrete evidence that couldn't be disputed. It was like watching a prosecution lay out an ironclad case against a defendant who had nowhere left to hide. And the verdict from the public gallery, from the MPS watching, from the millions of people watching on television and online was becoming clearer by the second. Guilty. Guilty of breaking promises. Guilty of putting political survival ahead of the national interest. Guilty of being just another in a long line of politicians who said whatever it took to get elected and then governed however they pleased once they had power. But the Reform MP saved their most devastating attack for last. They brought up the topic that Starmer had been desperately trying to avoid all afternoon, the topic that his press team had worked overtime to bury, that his MPS had been instructed not to discuss, that represented the biggest scandal his government had faced so far. The donations, the luxury gifts, the free holidays and expensive dinners and designer clothes that senior Labour ministers, including Starmer himself, had accepted from wealthy donors while telling the rest of the country to tighten their belts and accept lower living standards for the greater. Not just to apologise, not just to promise to do better, but to step down and let someone who actually cared about the British people take over. The chamber erupted again, louder than before. Labour MPS were on their feet, screaming that this was outrageous, that the Reform MP had gone too far. But their protest sounded hollow, desperate even, because everyone watching knew that the Reform MP had simply said what millions of people across the country were already thinking. Starmer had failed, his government had failed, and the British people deserved better than another politician who promised the world and delivered nothing but disappointment and broken dreams. This wasn't just a bad day at Prime Minister's questions. This was a moment that would define Starmer's premiership, a moment that would be replayed on news channels and social media for days, weeks, maybe even months to come. And as the Reform MP finally sat down, the damage was done. Starmer looked shaken, cornered, exposed for exactly what he was. Just another politician who'd let power corrupt him before he'd even had a chance to use it for good. The aftermath of the Reform MP's attack was immediate and brutal. Social media exploded within seconds. Clips of the exchange were already being shared thousands of times across Twitter, Facebook and TikTok. The hashtag demanding Starmer's resignation was trending within minutes, climbing higher and higher as more people watched the footage and shared their own fury. This wasn't just Westminster bubble drama that only political nerds cared about. This was cutting through to real people, ordinary voters who'd been feeling let down and ignored for months, but hadn't quite been able to put their anger into words. The Reform MP had done it for them. They'd stood up in the most important political arena in the country and said exactly what needed to be said without fear, without hesitation, without the usual political calculations about how it would play in the media or whether it would upset the wrong people. And the British public were responding with overwhelming support. Comment sections were flooded with messages from people sharing their own stories of betrayal, their own experiences of being promised change and receiving nothing, their own frustration with a political system that seemed designed to protect those at the top while abandoning everyone else. But back in the chamber, Starmer was trying to salvage something from the wreckage. He stood up again, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been at the start of the session. He tried to dismiss the Reform MP's accusations as political point scoring, as opposition parties doing what opposition parties always do, trying to tear down the government without offering real solutions. It was a weak response, and everyone knew it, because the Reform MP hadn't just criticised. They'd provided evidence, statistics, direct quotes from Starmer himself that proved beyond any doubt that promises had been broken. This wasn't about political games. This was about accountability. This was about a Prime Minister being confronted with his own words and being forced to explain why none of them had translated into action. Starmer tried to pivot to talking about the long-term plan, about how governments can't fix everything overnight, about how the mess left by the previous administration was worse than anyone had anticipated. But these excuses were wearing thin. The British people had heard them all before from countless other politicians who'd failed to deliver, and they weren't buying it. And other MPs began to pile on now, sensing blood in the water. Conservative MPs who'd been relatively quiet earlier in the session suddenly found their voices echoing the Reform MP's criticisms and adding their own examples of Labour's failures. A Conservative backbencher stood up and talked about the catastrophic state of the immigration system, about how communities in their constituency were being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of people arriving with nowhere to house them, no resources to support them, and no plan from the government about what to do next. Another talked about the small businesses in their area that were closing down at an alarming rate because they simply couldn't cope with the increased tax burden and regulatory pressures. A third highlighted the NHS crisis in their local hospital, where patients were waiting 18 hours in emergency departments and cancer treatments were being delayed because there weren't enough doctors, nurses or equipment. Every single example hammered home the same message. Starmer's government wasn't working. The promises weren't being kept and people were suffering because of it. Even some Labour MPs looked uncomfortable now, squirming in their seats as they listened to criticism they knew was justified, knowing that their own constituents were saying exactly the same things in angry emails and confrontational constituency meetings. The Speaker was struggling to maintain order as the session descended into something resembling a free-for-all. MPs were shouting over each other, accusations were flying in every direction, and the careful choreography that usually characterises Prime Minister's questions had completely broken down. This was raw, unfiltered political combat, and it was compelling viewing precisely because it felt real in a way that Westminster rarely does. The polite conventions had been abandoned, the scripted responses had been torn up. What remained was genuine anger, genuine frustration, and genuine questions about whether the people running the country had any idea what they were doing or any real intention of keeping the promises they'd made. The Reform MP sat watching all of this unfold, a slight smile on their face. They'd lit the fuse, and now they were watching the explosion. They'd done exactly what they'd set out to do. They'd exposed Starmer, they'd given voice to millions of frustrated voters, and they'd created a political moment that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. Starmer made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. He stood up and tried to go on the offensive, accusing the Reform MP and others of scaremongering, of exaggerating problems, of playing politics with serious issues, but it fell completely flat. Because everyone in that chamber and everyone watching at home could see through it. These weren't exaggerations. These were real problems affecting real people. The NHS crisis was real. The cost of living crisis was real. The immigration chaos was real. The broken promises were real. And no amount of political spin could make any of it disappear. Starmer looked frustrated now, almost angry, as if he couldn't understand why people weren't accepting his explanations and giving him more time. But that's the problem with breaking trust. Once it's gone, it's almost impossible to get back. And Starmer had burned through his credibility faster than any Prime Minister in recent memory. He'd had the goodwill of millions of voters who genuinely wanted him to succeed, who were ready to give him a chance to prove that politics could be different. And he'd squandered it all in a matter of months through a combination of broken promises, political scandals, and a complete failure to deliver on even the most basic commitments. As the session finally drew to a close, with the Speaker gavelling everything to order one last time, the damage assessment was already beginning. Political commentators were calling it one of the most brutal exchanges in Prime Minister's questions history. Journalists were already writing their analysis pieces about what this meant for Starmer's future and whether his government could survive this level of public backlash. Opposition parties were preparing follow-up attacks, knowing that Starmer was wounded and vulnerable. And most importantly, ordinary voters were making up their minds about whether they'd been conned, whether they'd made a terrible mistake trusting Labour, and whether anything would ever actually change in British politics. The Reform MP had achieved something remarkable. In just a few minutes of speaking, they'd crystallised the national mood, they'd held power to account in a way that felt authentic and necessary, and they'd reminded everyone watching that M and PS are supposed to represent the people who elected them, not the party machines or the special interests or the wealthy donors. It was a masterclass in opposition politics, and it had left Starmer looking weaker than he'd ever looked before. The question now was whether he could recover from this, or whether this moment would be remembered as the beginning of the end for his troubled premiership. The real fallout from this explosive confrontation was only just beginning. As MPs filed out of the chamber, the media scrum outside was already in full swing. Reporters were shouting questions at anyone who'd stopped to talk, cameramen were jostling for position, and political analysts were being rushed into television studios to give their instant reactions. The consensus was unanimous. This had been a disaster for Starmer, not just a bad day at the office, but a genuine political crisis that threatened to undermine his entire premiership. The Reform MP's brutal takedown had exposed weaknesses that Starmer's team had been desperately trying to hide, and now those weaknesses were on full display for the entire country to see. Within the hour, the main evening news broadcasts were leading with the story. Clips of the most devastating moments were being played on repeat, with political editors providing commentary that ranged from shock to deeply critical of how Starmer had handled the onslaught. Phone-in radio shows were lighting up with callers expressing their anger and disappointment. The narrative had shifted dramatically, and it wasn't in Starmer's favour. Inside Labour Party headquarters, there was panic. Senior advisors were in emergency meetings trying to figure out how to respond to this crisis and limit the damage. But the problem was that there were no easy answers. They couldn't deny the Reform MPs' accusations because the evidence was too clear. They couldn't dismiss the concerns as trivial because millions of voters shared them. And they couldn't attack the messenger because that would only make them look more out of touch and defensive. They were trapped, forced to watch as the story dominated news cycles and social media feeds, growing bigger and more damaging with each passing hour. Some Labour MPs were privately admitting that the Reform MP had raised legitimate points, that their own constituents had been saying similar things for weeks, and that the party needed to take this seriously rather than just dismissing it as opposition grandstanding. These voices were quickly silenced by part leadership, but the cracks were showing. The unity that Labour had enjoyed in the early days of their government was fracturing under the pressure of broken promises and failed policies. The Reform Party, meanwhile, was capitalising on the moment brilliantly. Their social media team had cut together the best clips of their MP's performance and were sharing them across every platform. Fundraising emails were going out to supporters, highlighting how Reform was the only party willing to stand up to the establishment and fight for ordinary people. Membership applications were flooding in from voters who felt that finally someone was speaking for them. The party's polling numbers, which had been respectable but not spectacular, began to tick upward as more people saw the clips and resonated with the message. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough moment that smaller parties dream of. The chance to show that they're not just protest votes, but serious political forces capable of holding the government to account. And the Reform MP who delivered this devastating performance was becoming a household name overnight, their face plastered across newspapers and news websites, their words being quoted and analysed and debated in pubs and living rooms across the country. But beyond the immediate political theatre, something deeper was happening. The confrontation had tapped into a wellspring of frustration and disillusionment that had been building for years, maybe even decades. People were tired of being lied to. They were tired of politicians who said one thing to get elected and did something completely different once in power. They were tired of seeing their communities struggle while those in Westminster seemed completely disconnected from their reality. They were tired of working harder and harder but falling further and further behind. They were tired of being told that things were getting better when their own eyes and their own bank accounts told them the opposite. The Reform MP's speech hadn't created this anger. It had simply given it a voice, a focal point, a moment where all that pent-up frustration could finally be expressed. And that's why it resonated so powerfully. It wasn't just about Starmer or Labour or this particular government. It was about a broken system that seemed incapable of delivering for the people it was supposed to serve. As the days following this confrontation unfolded, the pressure on Starmer only intensified. Newspapers that had previously been supportive started running critical editorials, questioning his leadership. Political betting markets showed plummeting odds on him surviving a full term as Prime Minister. Labour's poll numbers began to slide as voters who'd given them a chance started to reconsider their decision. Cabinet ministers were forced to do the media rounds, defending their boss and trying to change the subject. But they all looked uncomfortable doing it, knowing that they didn't have good answers to the questions being asked. Some were even beginning to position themselves for a potential leadership contest just in case Starmer's position became untenable. The vultures were circling and everyone could see it. Meanwhile, the Reform MP continued to drive home their advantage, giving interviews where they hammered the same themes, appearing at rallies where they were greeted like heroes and making it clear that this was just the beginning of their campaign to hold the government accountable. The British public were watching all of this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and cynicism. Satisfaction that finally someone had said what needed to be said. That finally a politician had been properly challenged and exposed. But also cynicism because they'd seen this pattern before. Politicians rise and fall. Promises are made and broken. Scandals erupt and fade. But nothing fundamental ever seems to change. The system grinds on, serving those at the top while everyone else struggles. Still, there was something different about this moment. Maybe it was the sheer brutality of the confrontation. Maybe it was the perfect timing, coming at a point when frustration with Starmer had reached a critical mass. Maybe it was the fact that it had all happened live in full view of the public with no spin doctors able to soften the blow. Whatever the reason, this felt like a turning point. Not necessarily the end of Starmer's premiership, though that was now a real possibility, but certainly the end of any honeymoon period, any benefit of the doubt, any willingness from the public to give him more time to deliver on his promises. The Reform MP who'd started this firestorm sat in their office later that evening, watching the news coverage and reading through the thousands of messages of support flooding their inbox. They knew they'd done something significant, something that would define their political career and possibly change the trajectory of British politics. But they also knew that the hard work was just beginning. Holding the government to account in one spectacular moment was one thing. Following through, maintaining pressure, offering real alternatives, and building a movement that could actually change things was something else entirely. The spotlight was on them now, and the expectations were enormous. Could they live up to them? Could Reform translate this moment into sustained political success? Could they actually deliver the change that so many people were desperate for? Only time would tell. But for now, in this moment, they'd achieved something remarkable. They'd made Starmer squirm, they'd given voice to millions of frustrated voters, and they'd reminded everyone that politicians are supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. And that, in the often cynical and disappointing world of Westminster politics, was no small achievement. This was a moment that would be remembered, analysed and debated for years to come. A moment when the careful facade of political respectability cracked wide open and the raw truth came pouring out for everyone to see.